Okay, so let's look at how we can work with some string type variables in C#. Here we have a sample application. We just have first name, last name, and we're outputting both of those to our console window. Now, how can we actually join two strings together? So I have one variable first name, one variable last name. Right now it puts them separately on two different lines, but how do I join these together? So what we can do here, we can what's called concatenating two strings, and that's just a fancy way of saying join them together. And concatenation, it could be like concat for short. These are words you're going to hear perhaps in the future if you continue your C# journey. So let's look at joining these two strings together. What I'm going to do, I'm going to use what's called a plus operator. So you can see this plus here. And what that does, it just takes this string, and joins them together. Very simple, isn't it? So now we run the application, we can see we have SpongeBob SquarePants on one line. But you can see there's no white space in between here. So let's look at adding that. So what we can do here is add another string and use the plus symbol again. So what we're doing here, we're taking the first variable, first name, we're concatenating it, so joining it to this empty white space, which is also a string, and then joining it to the last name, which is a variable here. Now this isn't a variable, and we don't need variables in here. We could easily do this, and it's exactly the same. And that way we're not even using that variable, but the output will be exactly the same. So that's how we can join two strings together. And just so you fully understand, we can even create a variable here, and we can do first name plus last name, and then we can put full name in here, and we're going to have exactly the same result. And let's not forget our white space here, so it looks kind of presentable, and we're going to run the application. And you can see here we have exactly the same result. We're just using a variable here called full name, and that's just adding these together, concatenating them together with the white space. So that's how we can join two strings together very simply. So substrings, what is a substring? Now a substring is just one of many different things you can do with strings in C#. So here's an example here. We have a variable called name. It has SpongeBob SquarePants set as the value, and we're outputting it to the screen. Now, for example, say I want to extract a certain part of this string. I want to extract the word sponge from it. I don't want the rest of this stuff. I only want this part right here. Now what we can do, we can use something called a substring method to extract a portion of our string. And that's what a substring is. It's a part of a string. I could take this, I could take this, I could take anything I want. I could even take one letter if I wanted. So let's look at how we can actually use a substring. So what I'm going to do, I want to extract sponge. The variable, we can call it what we want. Let's call it sponge, why not? And we want to initialize sponge, so we use our equal sign. And when we work with a variable, what we can do is put the variable, the name of the variable here, which is name in this case. And when we use a period or a dot, whatever you want to call it afterwards, we have all these different things we can do with it. So some of the common ones are always at the top with this black star next to them, and one of them is substring. We can do lots of things. We can replace, we can lower the characters, we can split it, lots of different things we can do. So substring is what we want to use. We can double click this. And when we open parentheses here, we have a few options we can do with it. Now I'm going to talk about this stuff a lot later when I talk about methods, but for the most part, I'm just going to put two things in here, and that is that. So what I want to do here, now in C#, everything starts at 0, index is at 0. So this string here, this character here, the S, that is position 0. The P is position 1, 2, 3. Everything starts at 0. So remember that moving forward. So S is character position 0 of our string SpongeBob SquarePants. So the first value here is 0 because we want to start at position 0. And then the next value is how many letters you want to extract from the string. So sponge, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's actually 6. So now we want to extract the first 6 characters, sponge, right here. So these are the values we put in here. Now, if this is confusing to you, let's go back to where we talked about console write line. We had console write line and we opened the parentheses, and in here we want to put our variable onto the black window. Now substring, in this example, we want to give it 2 values. And when we give it 2 values, we separate them with a comma, like so. So we want the first character, S, and we want to count 6 characters forward, which should extract sponge. Now we want to put sponge on our console window so we can actually see the result. So let's compile our application, and we can see we've output sponge right here. And that is very simplistically how the substring works. If we want to extract, say, Bob, for example, then we start at position 6 and count 3 characters forward. And then we can see we've extracted Bob. So that is how a substring works. So one other thing we can do is what's called a replacement. So we have SpongeBob SquarePants here. And say we want to replace SpongeBob with something else, say Patrick or something like that. So let's create a new variable. We'll call it Pat for Patrick. It doesn't matter what we call it. We're working with our name string here, so we'll leave this. And when we press the dot again, we get all these things we can do with it. And we're going to double click replace. And with replace, we can replace anything with anything else. So what I want to do, I want to replace SpongeBob. And I want to give it the new value Patrick. Always end with a semicolon. So what that is going to do is take the name, everything inside the name, so it's taking all of this. We want to replace every occurrence with SpongeBob, type that wrong, and we want to replace it with Patrick. Then the result of that operation is stored in Pat, and then we can put Pat here. So if we run the application, we can see now it says Patrick SquarePants. That's because we're replacing every occurrence of SpongeBob with Patrick. And when I say every occurrence, let's try this. Run the application. It's replaced every occurrence of SpongeBob with Patrick. So that is how replacement works in C#. And again, you don't have to store the result of this calculation into a whole new variable. We can shortcut that and just put it there, and that will equally work just fine. You can see Patrick, SquarePants, Patrick. So you can see that is how replacement works when dealing with strings. Another thing we can do with strings is work out the length of the string, and that one's very simple. Here I have a variable called example. This is everything inside that variable. And to work with example, I put a little dot afterwards and I type length. To make this quicker, you can double click this or you can press the tab key on the keyboard. And that might be a lot quicker for you to enter these values in the future. So when I compile the application now, we can see that this sentence here is 44 characters long. And that's quite useful when you use substrings to, extract certain things from a substring. Let's talk about another method called index of. Now what index of does is if you specify a word like SpongeBob, it'll actually tell you the index of where this is in the string. So rather than counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So character position 22, for example, we don't have to count. We can actually use a method called index of. So if I put example, index of, and then I want to put in, for example, SpongeBob. And that will be in double quotes because SpongeBob is a string. And we want to store the result of this. Now, if we hover over index of, you can see over here next to this pink cube, it says int. That means the result of this will be an integer. So let's define a new integer, and I'll just call it index. And then I'm going to output the index to the window. So let's run this real quick. So you can see apparently SpongeBob is a character position 22 here. So that's 22 characters in. So index of is another method which is quite useful to get the index of whatever word you would like. You could put in, for example, E. Just something like that. And if we run that, it gets the first occurrence of E, which is this one here. So 0, 1, 2. That's the first occurrence. And again, it has lots of different things you can do with index of, but that's an example.